we will wander together into the vast and beautiful history of Mexico. Tonight's story is one of ancient temples rising under a sun of gold, of civilizations whispering their knowledge into stone, of peoples who gazed at the stars and measured time in ways so precise they still astonish us today. It is a story of empires, of struggles, of resilience, and of enduring traditions that flow like music from one century into the next. So rest now, feel your body sinking into comfort, and let us drift gently backward across centuries, across millennia, until we find ourselves at the dawn of human presence in the land that would one day be called Mexico. Long before cities, before pyramids, before empires, small bands of early humans crossed into the Americas, wandering through forests and plains, hunting, gathering, leaving faint traces of their existence on rock walls and in hidden caves. In Mexico's Sierra de San Francisco, in the quiet deserts of Baja California, ancient cave paintings still whisper their stories, figures of deer, of hunters, of mysterious red silhouettes left upon stone. These murals, thousands of years old, remind us that even in prehistory, people sought to leave behind more than footprints. They left symbols, visions, and echoes of a life lived beneath the same stars we see tonight. The land itself was rich and varied. Mountains rose like guardians, volcanoes breathed smoke and fire, and rivers cut deep lifelines through the valleys. In the south, lush jungles hummed with insects and hidden temples yet to come. In the north, deserts stretched wide, their silence broken only by the wind. It was a land waiting to cradle civilizations. From this ancient soil arose the Olmec, often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica. Around 1200 BCE, their great centers thrived in the Gulf Coast lowlands. Places like San Lorenzo and La Venta. Imagine walking quietly through their ceremonial sites. Immense stone heads carved from basalt, each taller than a person, their faces calm, lips closed, eyes watching over the ages. Their exact meaning remains a mystery. Were they rulers, ancestors, guardians? But their weight in stone speaks of a society already skilled in engineering, already dreaming on a grand scale. The Olmecs also gave to the world one of its earliest ball games. On smooth courts of packed earth, players struck a heavy rubber ball with their hips, keeping it in play without hands or feet. This game was more than sport. It was sacred, a reflection of cosmic cycles, of life and death. Echoes of this game would later carry through centuries into Maya and Aztec courts, where the thud of rubber against stone was the heartbeat of ritual. But perhaps most profound was the Olmec gift of time. They began to develop the calendars and numerical systems that later civilizations would refine. They carved symbols, perhaps early scripts, onto jade and stone. Their influence stretched wide north into the Valley of Mexico, south into the jungles of Chiapas and Guatemala. They were not merely a people. They were the seed of civilizations yet to bloom. By the time the Olmec faded, new powers were rising. Among them was the mighty city of Teotihuacan, whose name, given centuries later by the Aztecs, means the place where the gods were born. By around 200 CE, this city had become one of the largest in the world. Its wide avenue of the dead stretching in perfect symmetry, its pyramids reaching upward as if to touch the sky. Imagine walking its broad avenue at dusk. The pyramid of the sun looms ahead, vast and silent, built with millions of stone blocks, each placed by countless hands. To the side, the pyramid of the moon gazes toward the mountains, while the temple of the feathered serpent gleams with serpent heads carved into its walls. Beneath the city's surface lay tunnels and chambers, where priests tended sacred fires. Above, markets thrummed with the sound of traders selling obsidian blades. Bright feathers, cacao, and ceramics painted with red and black figures. Teotihuacan was a place of mystery, a cosmopolitan heart where many peoples lived Zapotecs, Maya, Otomio, woven together in a great urban experiment. Its murals still glow faintly with color, showing jaguars, serpents, and gods of rain and fertility. Yet, curiously, the city left no written records of its rulers. Its story is painted in stone and silence. Its fall, around the year 550, still debated. Famine, fire, revolt, no one knows for sure. But its influence lived on, its memory carried by the peoples who inherited its spirit of architecture and cosmic vision. Meanwhile, in the humid jungles of the and Guatemala, another civilization blossomed, the Maya. They built cities like Palenque, Quito, and later, cities rising like emerald crowns from the rainforest canopy. They were master astronomers, charting Venus, the moon, the sun, with precision that still amazes modern science. They created calendars so exact that the turning of centuries could be predicted with uncanny accuracy. The Maya wrote their words in glyphs, beautiful and complex symbols painted in codices or carved into stone, steely. In these inscriptions, we hear their voices still, kings recounting battles and rituals, scribes recording dynasties, priests marking the dance of the heavens. They believed the cosmos was layered with heavens above and underworld below, and their temples were stairways between worlds. At night, when the Milky Way stretched bright across the jungle sky, the Maya saw it as the great celestial serpent winding endlessly through time. And while the Maya flourished in the southeast, the Zapotecs thrived in Oaxaca's valleys. Their city of Monte sat high on a flattened mountaintop, its plazas aligned with the stars, its tombs filled with painted glyphs. They, too, played the sacred ballgame. They, too, carved their ancestors into stone. Monte's walls still stand, whispering of a people who balanced warfare, religion, and art. In this land of mountains and jungles, deserts and seas, civilizations rose and fell like waves, each leaving behind knowledge, customs, and stone that would guide those who came after. The Olmecs gave the seeds. Teotihuacan built the great template of urban power. The Maya reached into the stars. The Zapotecs carved wisdom into mountainsides. And from this long weaving of cultures, a new empire would one day emerge, the Aztec, whose capital would shine with splendor, only to be tested by the fires of conquest. But for now, as we rest here in this ancient world, imagine the night sky above Mesoamerica, thousands of years ago. The stars are sharp and bright. The fires in temples glow softly. The sound of drums carries through the air. And all around, life continues. Farmers tending maize, artisans shaping clay, priests whispering prayers to the gods of rain and sun. Time is slow, eternal, and we are cradled in its flow. This was the capital of the Aztec Empire, founded in the year 1325 upon an island in the lake. Legend tells us that the Mexica, a wandering people guided by prophecy, were searching for the place where their destiny would root. They had been told to find an eagle perched upon a cactus, devouring a serpent. At last, on a swampy island, they saw the vision. And there they built their home. That image ghoul cactus, serpent remains, to this day, on Mexico's flag, a living symbol of origin. Imagine entering at its height in the early 1500s. A causeway stretches across the lake, its stone path lined with merchants and travelers. Canoes glide through canals, their paddles dipping softly, carrying maize, cacao, and fresh flowers. As you near the city, the skyline rises, white palaces, temples painted red and blue, gardens floating on rafts called chinampas. Birds flutter among blossoms, and the air carries the sound of drums and conch shells. At the heart of the city stands the Templo Mayor, a massive twin pyramid reaching skyward, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun, and Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Priests in feathered headdresses climb its steep steps, their shadows long against the stone, their voices chanting as incense drifts upward in slow, curling smoke. Around the temple, plazas throng with life. Dancers spin in bright costumes, merchants sell turquoise and obsidian, scribes paint histories onto deerskin codices. Was not only magnificent, it was ingenious. Its chinampas, the floating gardens, anchored in the lake's shallow waters. Its aqueducts brought fresh water into the city. Its streets and canals formed a network so ordered that Spanish chroniclers, upon first seeing it, compared it to Venice. At its height, the city may have held over 200,000 people, making it one of the largest in the world. The Aztec people were not a single tribe, but an empire, expanding outward through alliance and conquest. They forged the Triple Alliance with Texcoco and Tlacopan, extending their reach across central Mexico. Tribute flowed in: cacao from the south, cotton, gold, jaguar skins, feathers of the quetzal bird that shimmered like emerald fire. Markets, such as the one in Tlatelolco, astonished even hardened Spanish conquistadors with their scale, and order tens of thousands of people trading daily, governed by strict rules, with judges overseeing fairness. Yet the Aztec world was also steeped in ritual, for they believed the cosmos was fragile, kept alive through balance and offering. The sun, they thought, needed nourishment, and so they performed ceremonies of sacrifice, offering human hearts upon the temple stone to ensure the rising of the dawn. To them, this was not cruelty, but duty, the fulfillment of a cosmic covenant. It is a practice that startles us today, but within their worldview, it was sacred necessity, a way of weaving human life into the eternal cycle of creation. They were also keepers of knowledge. The Aztec codices recorded not only history, but astronomy, calendars, and tribute lists. They measured the heavens, tracked eclipses, and maintained the tonal pahuli, the sacred 260-day calendar, alongside the solar year. Their poets, known as Tlamatinam, the wise ones, wrote verses of longing, philosophy, and the brevity of life. We only come to dream, we only come to sleep, they sang. It is not true that we come to live upon this earth. These were words of reflection, soft as the night wind, still echoing across centuries. But fate, ever turning, brought new winds from across the ocean. In 1519, and his band of Spaniards arrived upon the coast of Veracruz. Armored strangers riding animals the Mexica had never seen before horses. They carried steel and gunpowder, and with them came both awe and devastation. Formed alliances with peoples long resentful of Aztec tribute and dominance, most notably the Tlaxcalans. Step by step, they moved inland until they reached the Valley of Mexico itself. When at last the Spaniards entered, they marveled at its splendor. They were welcomed, in part, by Emperor Moctezuma II, whose caution and uncertainty shaped those fateful months. Some say he believed might be linked to Quetzalcoatl, the returning god, though historians debate this. Still, the fragile welcome soon shattered into violence, mistrust, and rebellion. In 1521, after brutal battles, famine, and smallpox and unseen disease carried by the invaders, the great city fell. Its temples burned, its palaces crumbled, and upon its ruins, the Spanish raised their colonial capital, Mexico City. The fall of was not the end of its people, but the beginning of a long, painful transformation. Indigenous knowledge, languages, and traditions endured, often hidden beneath the surface, carried quietly through generations. The Nahuatl language still whispered in marketplaces. The gods still remembered in disguised forms, even as Catholic churches rose where pyramids once stood. Mexico's story entered a new era, the Spanish colonial period, a time of blending, conflict, where two worlds became one. And so, as night deepens, imagine the ruins of beneath the foundations of modern Mexico City. The stones still sleep below the streets, the past layered beneath the present, waiting in silence. Above them, the city hums with life. But if you close your eyes, you can still feel the shimmer of the lake. The song of drums, the scent of copal smoke rising to the heavens. The Aztec world has not vanished, lingers, woven into the very soul of Mexico. The year is 1521. The city of lies in ruins. Its great temples toppled, its canals filled with rubble. Smoke lingers in the air, mingling with the quiet sorrow of a people whose world has been upended. Over these broken stones, the Spanish began to raise a new city. Mexico became Ciudad, the capital of a colony that the Spaniards called New Spain. The transformation was profound, yet it unfolded slowly, like mist spreading across a valley. Imagine the construction of Mexico City. Spanish architects designed wide plazas, churches with tall bell towers, palaces with carved balconies. The Metropolitan Cathedral, begun in the 1500s, rose upon the very site of the Templo Mayor, its heavy stones echoing with chants in Latin rather than Nahuatl hymns. But beneath those stones, in the soil, lay the foundations of the Aztec temple. Silent and waiting, a reminder that the past could not be erased, only buried. The Spanish crown brought with it not only soldiers, but priests, monks, and administrators. The Catholic Church became one of the most powerful forces in the land. Monasteries spread across the countryside, where friars sought to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. They burned some codices, yet they also taught indigenous scribes to write their languages with the Latin alphabet, inadvertently preserving Nahuatl, Maya, and other tongues in new forms. The friars staged elaborate festivals, blending indigenous and Catholic rituals until new traditions were born, fiestas that still light Mexico's nights with music and color. At the same time, Spanish settlers carved vast estates called haciendas across the valleys. Indigenous people were forced into labor systems, their tribute now owed not to emperors, but to colonial lords. Yet within this harsh new order, resistance and adaptation persisted. The ancient knowledge of farming and weaving endured. In kitchens, maize and beans blended with pork and wheat brought from Europe, creating dishes that would define Mexican cuisine. Imagine the sizzle of maize tortillas next to bubbling stews of meat and spices from two worlds. Silver mines, especially in Zacatecas and Guanajuato, poured vast riches into Spanish ships. For centuries, Mexico was the heart of Spain's empire in the Americas, a source of precious metals that funded European wars and palaces. Great caravans of mules carried silver to Veracruz, where galleons awaited. Alongside silver traveled cacao, cochineal, dye made from tiny insects, producing a red so vivid it astonished Europe. Vanilla and maize. From Asia, through the Manila galleons, came silk, porcelain, and spices, landing in Acapulco and blending into local markets. Thus, Mexico became a crossroads of global trade, linking continents through its harbors. But wealth also deepened inequality. Indigenous people and enslaved Africans labored under harsh conditions, while Spanish-born elites, the Peninsulars, held the highest offices. Those of mixed heritage, the mestizos, grew in number, creating a complex society layered with race, class, and power. Over time, a new identity began to form, not wholly Spanish, not wholly indigenous, but something distinctively Mexican, woven of many threads. In the countryside, quiet resistance never ceased. Indigenous communities preserved rituals behind the veil of Catholic saints. They whispered ancient prayers beneath church bells. They passed down herbal medicine and oral traditions, ensuring that the roots of their culture stayed alive, even as the branches bent beneath colonial rule. Rebellions sparked from time to time, uprisings against tribute demands, against forced labor, against injustice, but most were crushed swiftly by the colonial order. Still, beneath the surface, the desire for freedom simmered, waiting for its moment. Meanwhile, Mexico's cities flourished with learning and art. In 1551, the Spanish crown founded the Royal and Pontifical University of Mexico, one of the first universities in the Americas. Printing presses brought books, and scholars debated philosophy and law. Out of this world came luminous figures like Sor Juana de la Cruz, a self-taught nun of the 1600s who became a poet, playwright, and intellectual of astonishing depth. She wrote of love, of knowledge, of the struggles of women in a male-dominated world. By candlelight, in her convent cell, she penned verses that still echo today, reminding us that even in silence, voices can shine. The colonial centuries were long, stretching across 300 years. They were filled with contradictions, splendor and suffering, beauty and exploitation, faith and rebellion. The people of Mexico were not passive under Spanish rule. They adapted, they resisted, they created. They turned foreign instruments into mariachi music, foreign saints into protectors of their villages, and foreign words into new languages infused with their own. By the late 1700s, winds of change swept across the world. Enlightenment, ideas of reason and liberty spread from Europe. Revolutions erupted in the United States in 1776, in France in 1789, in Haiti in 1791. The very foundations of empire trembled. In Mexico, Criollos, those of Spanish descent born in the Americas, began to resent the privileges reserved for peninsulares. They too dreamed of independence, of a land that could be ruled by its own children rather than a distant king. And then, in 1810, the dream ignited. A parish priest named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, in the small town of Dolores, rang the church bell in the early hours of September 16th, calling his people to rise. With his voice thundering into the night, he declared the famous Grito de Dolores, the cry of Dolores that marked the beginning of Mexico's struggle for freedom. Behind him gathered farmers, workers, indigenous villagers, armed not with steel, but with courage, carrying torches, clubs, and whatever they could wield. They marched, crying out for an end to tyranny. The colonial world was crumbling. Centuries of silence gave way to the roar of rebellion. And thus began the long and turbulent war of independence, where Mexico would slowly, painfully carve out its own path. Do you know how Mexico won its independence? Let me tell you. It started with a bell. On September 16th, 1810, a parish church in the town of Dolores, Mexico, the call to worship was given by Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla. It was not an ordinary call, but a cry of rebellion against the Spanish rulers. Carried on the September wind, his voice echoed through the town and beyond, urging the people to rise up. And they did. Farmers in simple tunics, villagers armed with sticks and machetes, they marched that night, their torches blazing, following Hidalgo's lead. They weren't soldiers, but they were passionate. Under the banner of Our Lady of Guadalupe, they fought. The war for independence had begun. And so Mexico's long struggle for freedom started with a single cry, the Grito de Dolores. To learn more about this and other key moments in Mexican history, stay tuned. The year was 1821, and independence had finally been declared. After centuries beneath the rule of Spain, Mexico was free. Yet freedom, though sweet, came with uncertainty, for the new nation had not yet learned how to stand steady on its own. The streets of Mexico City, where bells rang for independence, also echoed with anxious questions. Who would rule? How would this vast land be governed? At first, power fell into the hands of D. Iturbide, the former royalist officer who had joined Vicente Guerrero to secure victory. In 1822, he crowned himself Emperor I of Mexico, raising the banner of monarchy over the young nation. But his reign was brief, fragile like a flame flickering in the wind. Mexico, weary of kings, soon grew restless. Just 1 year later, in 1823, Iturbide was forced to abdicate, and the first Mexican Republic was born. The Republic, however, was fragile. Factions formed quickly, centralists who favored a strong, centralized government, and federalists. The land itself was immense, stretching from California and Texas down to Central America, even including what is now Guatemala. Governing such a vast territory was daunting. Rebellions sparked, alliances shifted, and leaders rose and fell with dizzying speed. One figure loomed large in these turbulent decades: Antonio de Santa Anna, a charismatic and unpredictable general. Santa Anna would dominate Mexico's politics for decades, serving as president not once, but 11 times. He was a master of survival, embodying the instability of the young nation. Some called him a hero, others a tyrant. It was during these years that Mexico faced one of its greatest challenges: the loss of vast northern lands. In the 1830s, settlers from the United States poured into Texas, then part of Mexico. Tensions rose as the settlers resisted Mexican laws and sought autonomy. In 1836, rebellion broke out, leading to the famous Battle of the Alamo, where Mexican forces under Santa Anna crushed the Texian defenders. Yet, despite that victory, Mexico's grip on Texas loosened, and soon the territory declared independence as the Republic of Texas. But worse was yet to come. In 1846, war erupted between Mexico and the United States. The Mexican-American War. It was a conflict fought across deserts and valleys, with U.S. troops marching deep into Mexican soil. The war ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a treaty that forced Mexico to surrender nearly half its territory: present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. It was a loss so vast that it left deep scars upon the Mexican heart, wounds that still echo in memory. Yet, even in sorrow, resilience endured. Mexico, though smaller in size, was unbroken in spirit. Artists, poets, and common people carried forward their traditions. In villages, indigenous languages thrived alongside Spanish. In markets, maize and chiles, tortillas and tamales continued to nourish families, the flavors of Mexico never fading. In festivals, fireworks lit the night skies, blending Catholic saints with pre-Columbian echoes, a testament to the endurance of culture. In the midst of these trials, a new generation of leaders rose. Benito, a Zapotec from Oaxaca, emerged as a voice of reform. Born in poverty, orphaned young, he educated himself, studied law, and rose to prominence through determination and intellect. Stood for liberal ideals, equality before the law, limits on church power, and the defense of national sovereignty. His rise was remarkable, for he was the first indigenous president of Mexico, a symbol of hope for many. In the 1860s, as the country reeled from civil conflicts between liberals and conservatives, foreign eyes once again turned toward its lands. France, under Emperor Napoleon III, sought to establish an empire in the Americas. With European troops and conservative Mexican allies, they placed Maximilian of Habsburg upon the throne, declaring him Emperor of Mexico. Imagine the sight: a European prince arriving with his wife, Carlotta, dressed in fine uniforms, greeted with trumpets and ceremony. For a moment, it seemed a new empire had taken root. But Maximilian, though noble in character, was a man caught in a storm. He tried to rule with fairness, even embracing some liberal reforms, but he lacked the true support of Mexico's people, and his Republican forces resisted fiercely, retreating into the countryside, gathering strength. In time, the French withdrew, and Maximilian, abandoned, stood alone. In 1867, he was captured and executed upon a hillside. His death marked the end of foreign-imposed monarchy in Mexico and restored the republic. For many, this was a triumph of sovereignty, proof that Mexico, though battered, would never bow fully to foreign crowns. The years that followed were filled with struggle and rebuilding. Railroads began to stretch across the land. Cities grew, their plazas filled with fountains and music. But inequality remained, and storms brewed on the horizon. Mexico was not yet at peace, was only preparing for its next great upheaval. The year was 1876, and a man named Porfirio rose to power. A decorated general, had fought bravely in the wars against foreign intervention, a national hero of sorts. Yet, once in office, his rule would stretch far longer than anyone imagined. Over 3 decades, a period remembered as the Porfiriato. Porfirio brought order to a weary nation. His motto, whispered and written in decrees, was Pan o Palo, bread or the stick. Those who cooperated found opportunity and stability. Those who resisted faced repression. With a firm hand, as centralized authority, ensuring that railroads ran, telegraphs hummed, and foreign investments flowed. For the first time, steel rails connected distant corners of Mexico. Trains whistled through mountains and deserts, carrying silver, coffee, and maize. In the cities, modernity glimmered. Electric lights illuminated Mexico City's boulevards. French-style architecture rose with elegance. Wide avenues, ornate theaters, marble statues. Elites strolled in European fashion, sipping coffee in grand cafes, while orchestras played waltzes beneath chandeliers. It was as if a Paris of the Americas was being imagined into existence. Yet beneath this sheen of progress lay deep inequalities. While the wealthy elites enjoyed opulence, the countryside bore heavy burdens. Vast haciendas swallowed up communal lands, displacing indigenous and rural communities who had farmed for generations. Many peasants became laborers bound to the land, their freedoms diminished, their voices silenced. Wages were low, conditions harsh. In factories, workers toiled for long hours, their protests suppressed. Still, held power through control and spectacle. He celebrated national unity with grand festivals. In 1910, to mark the centennial of independence, Mexico City was adorned with triumphal arches and glowing lights. Cannons fired salutes, and parades marched through the streets. To the outside world, Mexico appeared prosperous, modern, and proud. But beneath the fireworks, discontent simmered. Among the voices of dissent was Francisco I. Madero, a wealthy but idealistic landowner from Coahuila. Madero believed in democracy and fair elections, principles long ignored under S. extended rule. He wrote passionately, calling for reform. And when once more claimed the presidency in 1910, Nito challenged him, igniting the flames of rebellion. Thus began the Mexican Revolution, a storm unlike any Mexico had seen before. In 1910, peasants, workers, and intellectuals rallied, not only against, but against the old order itself. Across the countryside, uprisings erupted. Two figures, in particular, captured the imagination of the people. Emiliano Zapata, from the state of Morelos, a man of the land, who carried the banner of agrarian reform. His cry was Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty. Zapata envisioned a Mexico where peasants reclaimed their ancestral lands, where dignity was restored to the villages. Pancho Villa, in the north, a charismatic, revolutionary, and former bandit, who led cavalry charges across deserts and plains. His forces, the Del Norte, struck with speed and boldness, winning the loyalty of workers, miners, and farmers. The revolution was not a single struggle, but a whirlwind of shifting alliances, betrayals, and battles. Fled into exile in 1911, and Madero briefly became president, heralding a new dawn. Yet his idealism clashed with entrenched powers. In 1913, a coup, known as the 10 Tragic Days, unfolded in Mexico City. Madero was betrayed, captured, and executed, plunging the nation back into chaos. For nearly a decade, Mexico burned with conflict. Armies marched, cities changed hands, leaders rose and fell. Villages were razed, yet songs of revolution filled the air. Corridos, sung by campfires, carrying tales of bravery and sorrow. The land itself seemed to groan with the weight of change. One figure who emerged from the turmoil was Venustiano Carranza, who sought to stabilize the nation. In 1917, under his leadership, a new Mexican constitution was drafted, one of the most progressive of its time. It promised land reform, labor rights, education, and limits on foreign ownership. Though not all promises were immediately fulfilled, it laid the foundation for modern Mexico, a beacon of hope written in ink and sealed with sacrifice. Yet even after the Constitution, the revolution's echoes lingered. Zapata was assassinated in 1919, betrayed by those who feared his influence. Pancho Villa, too, would eventually be gunned down in 1923. Their deaths cemented them as legends, martyrs of the people, whose names are still whispered with reverence in plazas and murals. By the 1920s, the nation was weary, scarred by years of strife. But out of the ashes of revolution, a new Mexico began to emerge. One that sought to weave together its diverse voices and forge a modern identity. And with this rebirth came an explosion of art, culture, and ideas, a renaissance that would make Mexico shine, not just with political change, but with creativity and spirit. The 1920s dawned softly, though scarred with the memory of war. The smoke of revolution had barely settled, yet the soil of Mexico felt charged with new energy. It was a time of rebuilding, of redefining what it meant to be Mexican, and of stitching together the torn fabric of a nation. The new leaders sought unity through vision. General Alvaro, who assumed power in 1920, extended an olive branch to the weary. Unlike, he understood the power of compromise. Though his rule was not without conflict, he sought to stabilize Mexico, to turn the ideals of the revolution into institutions. Under his watch, the promises of land reform began to trickle into reality, albeit slowly, and the wounds of civil war began to close. But perhaps the greatest transformation of this era was not only political, it was cultural. From the ashes of revolution rose a magnificent flowering of art and thought, a renaissance that carried Mexico's soul into the world. Across public buildings, great murals began to bloom like vast, colorful tapestries. Diego Rivera, with brush in hand, painted the struggles and triumphs of the people across towering walls. His frescoes were not mere decoration. They were stories, living chronicles of Mexico's history, blending indigenous traditions, colonial struggles, and revolutionary dreams. In his work, farmers bent over golden fields, workers raised hammers, and indigenous ancestors gazed with solemn dignity. Beside him, other muralists took up the challenge. Clemente Orozco, with fiery strokes, captured the raw intensity of revolution, the anguish of betrayal, the eternal fight for justice. David Alfaro Siqueiros, passionate and bold, fused politics and art, envisioning a future of solidarity and strength. These murals, painted not in private galleries, but in public spaces, belonged to everyone. They were art for the people, a visual echo of the revolution's spirit. In this same cultural dawn, a young woman named Frida Kahlo emerged. Her art was different tintement, surreal, deeply personal. Struck by tragedy, confined often to her bed, she painted her pain, her love, her defiance. Through self-portraits, she gazed into the mirror of her soul, blending indigenous motifs, bright colors, and symbolic dreams. Frida's work whispered of Mexico's inner life, its resilience, its contradictions. Together with Diego Rivera, she became a symbol of Mexican identity, her voice echoing long after her lifetime. This cultural rebirth extended beyond paint and canvas. Writers, poets, and musicians joined in, weaving narratives of Mexico's past and present. Vasconcelos, as Minister of Education, declared that Mexico's mission was not to erase its indigenous roots, but to celebrate them, to create a cosmic race, a blending of cultures into something new, something uniquely Mexican. Schools were built, libraries opened, literacy campaigns spread. For the first time, education reached villages where knowledge had long been denied. The soundscape, too, changed. Mariachi music, once local, began to echo across the nation, with violins, trumpets, and guitars singing tales of love, pride, and sorrow. Rancheras and corridos told the stories of common people, carrying the heartbeat of Mexico into cantinas and plazas. Politically, the nation was still fragile, was succeeded by Plutarco Calles, who sought to institutionalize the revolution. In 1929, he founded the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, though under a different name at first. This party would dominate Mexican politics for most of the 20th century, shaping the nation's destiny with a mix of stability and authoritarian control. Yet Calles's rule also sparked conflict. He clashed with the Catholic Church in what became known as the Cristero War of the late 1920s. Across rural Mexico, devout Catholics rose in armed rebellion against anti-clerical laws. Villages echoed with cries of "Viva Cristo Rey," "Long live Christ the King." The struggle was brutal, with thousands perishing in battles that scarred the countryside. Eventually, a compromise ended the bloodshed, but the memory of the Cristero War lingered like a shadow, a reminder of the deep spiritual currents that ran through Mexico. Into the 1930s, the winds of reform blew once more. Elected in 1934, became one of Mexico's most beloved leaders. Unlike others, he listened to the people, traveling by train to remote villages, speaking with farmers, workers, and indigenous communities. Undertook bold reforms. He redistributed vast tracts of land, breaking up the haciendas and granting them to peasants in communal ejidos. He strengthened labor unions, expanded education, and most famously, in 1938, he nationalized Mexico's oil industry. This act shook the world. For decades, foreign companies had profited from Mexico's oil fields, but with a stroke of his pen, declared that the oil belonged to the nation. Crowds cheered, bells rang, and ordinary Mexicans contributed money, jewelry, and even chickens to support the cause. The birth of Pemex, the state oil company, became a symbol of sovereignty and pride, a declaration that Mexico would no longer be exploited by outside powers. S. presidency marked a turning point, a moment when the ideals of the revolution felt realized in tangible ways. Land reform, labor rights, education, and economic independence gave new meaning to the sacrifices of those who had fought in the mountains and fields decades earlier. As the 1940s approached, Mexico was transformed. The revolution had given way to institutions, art had flourished, and the people carried a renewed sense of identity. The nation stood at a crossroads, entering an age of modernization, yet still rooted in traditions that whispered of pyramids, villages, and ancient gods. The dream of Mexico was alive, painted in murals, sung in plazas, written in constitutions, and lived in the everyday struggles of its people. The world shifted in the 1940s, its skies filled with warplanes, its oceans churning with fleets. The Second World War spread across continents, and even distant Mexico could not remain untouched. At first, the country stayed neutral, cautious, but when German submarines attacked Mexican oil tankers in the Gulf, the nation could no longer stand aside. In 1942, Mexico declared war on the Axis powers. Though far from Europe's battlefields, Mexico contributed in ways both practical and symbolic. The Arleñao, a squadron of Mexican pilots, trained in the United States and flew combat missions in the Philippines, fighting with quiet courage. On the home front, Mexico supplied vital resources, minerals, food to the Allies. Even more profoundly, the war opened the door for new labor agreements with the United States. The Bracero program allowed hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers to cross the border, filling jobs in American fields and factories while their own nation adjusted to the shifting tides of wartime demand. The war's end ushered in a new era of growth. Mexico, still scarred by the revolution, but now steadied under the PRI, began to modernize. The 1940s and 1950s were marked by what came to be called the Mexican miracle. Cities expanded, highways stretched across the land, factories sprouted, and industries thrived. From the bustle of Mexico City to the ports of Veracruz, the hum of engines replaced the silence of rural roads. The economy surged, averaging impressive growth for 2 decades. Rural families, drawn by the promise of opportunity, flocked to urban centers. Mexico City swelled, its population climbing rapidly, transforming it into one of the world's largest metropolises. Skyscrapers rose alongside colonial churches. Neon lights flickered above cobblestone streets, and the air buzzed with a mixture of tradition and modernity. But beneath this bright surface, contradictions simmered. The benefits of growth were uneven. For the middle class, life improved, education expanded, consumer goods became accessible, and hope was tangible. Yet, for peasants and workers, poverty persisted. Many of the same communities promised land and justice during the revolution found themselves left behind in the race toward modernization. The PRI, meanwhile, tightened its grip. It presented itself as the guardian of stability, the embodiment of the revolution's legacy, yet it ruled with careful control. Elections were held, but outcomes were orchestrated. Opponents were tolerated only at the margins. Power rotated among PRI leaders like a ritual, and the party's dominance became so entrenched that Mexicans jokingly called it a perfect dictatorship. Still, national pride surged in moments of triumph. In 1960, Mexico fully reclaimed its electric industry from foreign hands. In 1968, it would host the Olympic Games, a dazzling showcase of modern Mexico to the world. Stadiums were built, subways expanded, and banners of red, green, and white fluttered against the skyline. Athletes from every continent marched into the heart of Mexico City, where ancient pyramids stood not far from gleaming arenas. Yet, even in that moment of celebration, shadows stirred. The 1960s were a decade of youth movements worldwide, of students demanding change, of voices rising against conformity and inequality. In Mexico, students marched for democracy, for freedom of expression, for an end to authoritarian practices. Their rallies filled plazas with chants and songs. Their banners fluttered with hope. But as the Olympics approached, the government grew nervous, determined to present an image of harmony to the world. On the night of October 2nd, 1968, in the Plaza de las Tres Culturas at Tlaco, soldiers and police surrounded a student demonstration. Shots rang out, in the darkness. The square, filled with thousands, descended into chaos. Bodies fell, voices screamed, the air thick with terror. When dawn came, the plaza was quiet, but the memory of what became known as the Tlatelolco massacre would haunt Mexico for decades. The exact number of dead was hidden, silenced by officials, but whispers spread like smoke. The promise of the revolution, once painted in murals and written in manifestos, seemed betrayed once more. The 1970s carried Mexico deeper into a complicated present. Oil was discovered in abundance off the Gulf Coast, and hopes soared again. Revenues promised prosperity, and the government borrowed heavily, convinced the oil would secure the nation's future. Skyscrapers multiplied, new programs were launched, and optimism filled the air. Yet when oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, debts came crashing down, and with them, illusions of endless growth. The peso devalued, inflation rose, and ordinary families felt the sting. Jobs disappeared, savings eroded, and the glow of the Mexican miracle dimmed. The gap between rich and poor widened, and once more rural communities bore the heaviest burdens. Through all this, life in Mexico pulsed with resilience. Markets still bustled with color pyramids of chilies and corn glowing under the morning sun. Mariachi music echoed through plazas, its trumpets defiant. Families gathered around tortillas and beans, telling stories that stretched back centuries. Amid crises, the spirit of Mexico endured, rooted in traditions deeper than politics or economics. By the late 20th century, the PRI still held power, but beneath its polished facade, cracks had begun to spread. Civil society was stirring, opposition parties growing stronger, and whispers of democracy rising louder. The revolution's children, now long grown, were beginning to ask once again, what kind of Mexico do we truly want? The 1980s opened with promise, but beneath the surface, unease stirred. In September of 1985, the heart of Mexico shook literally. In the early hours of September 19th, as dawn was yet to break, a massive earthquake struck Mexico City. Buildings crumbled like sandcastles, highways split open, and entire neighborhoods fell into dust. The devastation was immense. Tens of thousands lost their lives, though the true toll was never fully revealed. What shocked the nation was not only the destruction, but the government's response, low, distant, at times indifferent. Ordinary citizens stepped forward instead. Neighbors dug through rubble with bare hands. Volunteers organized rescue brigades. Students carried water and supplies to the injured. In the silence after the quake, something powerful emerged. A civil society awakening, realizing that the people themselves held the strength to rebuild, to demand accountability, to claim a voice. The economic struggles of the decade deepened the discontent. Inflation spiraled, wages stagnated, and poverty spread. The PRI still ruled, but faith in its ability to deliver prosperity was fading. In Ijobarar, President Portillo, facing collapsing oil revenues, nationalized the banks in desperation. The peso tumbled, and families watched their savings evaporate. By 1988, Mexico stood at a crossroads. Elections were held, but they were clouded in controversy. Son of the Beloved led a coalition that challenged the PRI's dominance with unusual strength. On election night, as results poured in, the government's computer system mysteriously went down. When it returned, the PRI candidate, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, was declared winner. Many Mexicans believed the vote had been stolen. The phrase, "Se el sistema," the system crashed, became a symbol of broken trust. Salinas ushered in sweeping reforms. He privatized industries, encouraged foreign investment, and sought to integrate Mexico more deeply with the global economy. In 1994, Mexico entered the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, with the United States and Canada. Hopes were high that free trade would bring prosperity, yet for many small farmers, especially in the South, NAFTA spelled disaster. Cheap imported corn flooded markets, undermining livelihoods that had endured for centuries. On January 1st, 1994, the very day NAFTA took effect, a rebellion erupted. In the misty mountains of Chiapas, masked indigenous peasants, calling themselves the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, ESL, and seized towns and declared war on the Mexican government. Led by the enigmatic figure, Subcommandant Marcos, they demanded land, dignity, and respect for indigenous rights. Their uprising was brief militarily, but its echo was profound. Through written in poetic, dreamlike language, the Zapatistas drew global attention to Mexico's forgotten poor. The uprising revealed the gap between glossy promises of modernization and the harsh reality in indigenous villages. 1994 was also marked by tragedy. That spring, Luis Donaldo Colosio, the PRI's presidential candidate, was assassinated at a campaign rally in Tijuana. His death shocked the nation, a wound that has never fully healed. It seemed as though Mexico's destiny was twisting on a knife's edge. Despite turmoil, Salinas' successor, Ernesto Zedillo, ushered an unexpected change. In the late 1990s, reforms weakened the PRI's hold over the electoral system. The unthinkable began to feel possible, that one day the PRI might lose power. And so it happened. In the year 2000, after 71 years of uninterrupted rule, the PRI was defeated. Vicente Fox, candidate of the National Action Party PAN, became president. The moment was electrifying. Crowds filled plazas, waving flags, shouting, crying, as if the revolution's promised democracy had finally arrived after a century-long journey. Yet democracy brought its own challenges. Corruption, inequality, and violence remained. Still, the shift in power marked a profound transformation. Mexico had proven it could change governments peacefully, that its people's voices could shape their future. Through these storms of politics and economy, Mexico's culture remained vibrant, unbreakable. Its writers, Octavio Paz, Nobel laureate, exploring the labyrinths of identity. Its filmmakers, Luis Buñuel, Guillermo del Toro, Alfonso, capturing dreams and nightmares alike. Its music, crock, cumbia, ranchera, and the haunting strum of guitarzal carried Mexico's spirit into the world. The story of Mexico by the dawn of the 21st century was not one of simplicity. It was layered like the murals of Rivera, filled with light and shadow. A land ancient and modern, wounded yet resilient, forever redefining itself against the weight of history and the pull of dreams. The year 2000 had carried the fragrance of change, the feeling of dawn after a long night. For the first time in over 70 years, the PRI was out of power, and Vicente Fox of the PAN promised a new era. Mexico seemed poised to step into the millennium renewed. Yet, as with many turning points in its history, hope met reality in uneven waves. Fox's presidency brought openness and optimism, yet structural challenges, deep poverty, corruption, and inequality remained. Many had expected sweeping transformation, but the machinery of the state moved slowly. Still, symbolic change mattered. Mexico was no longer bound by one-party rule. The dream of democracy, so elusive for generations, now had roots. But the 21st century also ushered in darker currents. In Arlingling Liu, Philippe, also of the PAN, launched a full-scale military campaign against powerful drug cartels. Soldiers patrolled cities and highways, helicopters thudded above towns, and violence escalated. The so-called drug war unleashed a storm of bloodshed, pitting the government against cartels while communities were caught in between. Once proud plazas became battlegrounds, and the air in some towns filled not with music, but with fear. The toll was heavy. Tens of thousands lost their lives. Families fled, and entire villages emptied. Yet, amid the sorrow, stories of resilience emerged. Mothers formed search brigades, combing fields for missing loved ones. Journalists, at great risk, continued to uncover truths. Artists painted, sang, and wrote, keeping memory alive. Mexico's people, though battered, did not surrender their voice. In the political arena, shifts continued. After two PAN presidents, the PRI returned to power in 2012 under Enrique Peña Nieto, promising modernization and reform. At first, there was hope. Energy reforms opened the oil sector. Infrastructure projects gleamed, and Mexico's economy remained tied closely with global trade. Yet scandals soon eroded confidence. Allegations of corruption, rising inequality, and above all, the tragedy of Ayotzinapa in 2014, when 43 students disappeared, igniting outrage across the nation. Their faces, printed on posters and carried in marches, became symbols of a country demanding justice. Culturally, however, Mexico's global influence blossomed. Its filmmakers rose to international acclaim. Guillermo del Toro, weaving dark fairy tales. Alfonso, painting space and memory. Alejandro, unraveling human fragility. Collectively, they became known as Los Tres Amigos, lifting Mexico's cinema to the heights of world recognition. Musicians fused mariachi, rock, and hip-hop, carrying the country's rhythm across continents. Writers like Valeria Lucelli gave voice to modern migrations, borders, and identities. In 2018, another political shift shook the land. Manuel Obrador, AMLO, after years of struggle, won the presidency with a landslide. His message was one of transformation, promising to address corruption, poverty, and inequality. To his supporters, he embodied the revolution's unfinished promises. To his critics, he stirred fears of centralizing power. His rise reflected Mexico's enduring quest for leaders who listen, for systems that serve, for justice long denied. Meanwhile, the landscape of Mexico remained timeless, grounding its people through every storm. The pyramids of still touched the sky. The cenotes of shimmered like mirrors to the underworld. The markets of Oaxaca overflowed with colors. The beaches of the Pacific whispered with waves. Cities pulsed with contradictions. Mexico City, sprawling, chaotic, beautiful. A place where Aztec temples lie beneath colonial cathedrals and modern skyscrapers, all layered like pages of an endless story. The 21st century also carried challenges from beyond. Migration northward, economic ties with the United States, climate pressures, and global pandemics. Each wave tested Mexico's resilience, yet again and again, its people adapted, endured, and reinvented themselves. What makes Mexico eternal is not the power of its rulers or the weight of its struggles, but the pulse of its people, the tortilla maker rising before dawn, the street musician strumming beneath neon lights, the grandmother telling stories of ancestors who walked long before pyramids rose. Mexico is not one story, but millions, braided together in a river of memory. Tonight, as we close our eyes and drift with history, we feel that river moving, steady and eternal. Mexico, ancient and modern, scarred and proud, continues to write itself with every dawn, every song, every struggle, and every dream whispered beneath its stars.